There are so many things we could talk about after an incredibly invigorating series of talks so far. And I thought it would be useful to start out by exploring what this notion of intelligence means, because there have been some interesting ideas thrown out here. And one of the things that's come up is that it would seem that our standard model of intelligence that is brain-based, human-based, is perhaps inadequate. So I thought maybe it would be useful to try to unpack that a little bit. And Jeremy, I'm going to start with you here to see if several of the talks were making the case that there are actually a lot of analogies in the way plants communicate with the way humans communicate. For instance, the system of communication signals parallels with neural networks. I'm wondering how far you will take that analogy. I mean, so what are we really saying at bottom? There is fundamentally a similarity to the way the plant world, the animal world, the human world communicates, or are there some differences that we need to tease out here?
I'm supposed to give an answer to this?
Yes.
Okay. I think each person is entitled to have his or her opinion or position. It's essentially, how do you relate to the life around you? How do you feel about it? Essentially, what is your religion? Or how do you connect yourself to it? Do you separate yourself from it? Do you embrace it? Personally, I embrace it. I feel part of the whole fabric. I'm proud to be like a plant, and that's all there is to it. And this idea that there is this fundamental separation between us humans and the rest has, it's part of our culture. And this is where I think instead of rushing forward with a new definition of intelligence, what is on the agenda, as far as I'm concerned, is a self-critique of our own culture and of our own concept. So, and what still needs to be looked at is we're coming out of this culture that for centuries has established these boundaries between ourselves and the rest of the cosmos, and we've put ourselves on so many pedestals. And I think that we're still coming down from those pedestals. Science has helped that, but also becoming aware of what other cultures say helps that. So now, what was the question again? Could you?
Well, let me follow up with Suzanne. I mean, you were making a similar argument that there are all these ways that trees and other plants communicate, and there are these similarities with the way we do. Do you want to specify in any more detail about differences or similarities between, let's say, the way trees communicate and the way humans do?
You know, the question itself is very anthropomorphic. Right? I mean, it's a human-based question. It's very self-centered. Not for you. Sorry.
Don't we have to, though? I mean, we are humans. How else do we talk about this?
We have to have a language, and we need to communicate with each other, and so that's one way that we can relate. Right? We're trying to relate it to ourselves, but we really need to get out of that, because what we're talking about is on a different dimension, slightly different dimension than the way we interact. It doesn't make it any better or less. It's just different. So I think that the question needs to be reframed a little bit. Not your question, but the way we ask the question.
When you say different dimension, what do you mean?
Let's talk about the cellular level, maybe. Maybe that's one way I can talk about it. Like we always try to think, are they brains? Is it a neural system? Well, no, it's not. It's made of, in a tree, it's phloem and xylem, and they're different kinds of cells. It's not a neural cell. These are plant cells. But when you go down to quantum physics, the actual processes that are going on, it's energy, right? It's the movement and transformation of energy, and just because it's a different kind of cell, the result is a form of communication that just takes a different pathway. And so, and also, thinking about not just at the cellular level, but what's happening across the membranes. The membrane of the cell is where a lot of action takes place. And, a neural cell or an axon has got different transport mechanisms for moving stuff across its membranes. Plants have different transport mechanisms. They all use ATP. They all involve, molecules of different chemicals. They're, maybe packaged in slightly different proteins or signals, but they serve a purpose of communicating from cell to cell or plant to plant or individual to individual. And so I think we just need to get out of this trap of thinking that our or comparing our intelligence because we'll end up in this never-ending do loop of discussion. We need to move beyond it and say, yes, we know that this is happening in plants. Let's focus our energy now on figuring out what it means. What can it teach us?
Yeah, Jeremy?
Suzanne, I wanted to ask you a question on the basis of your presentation today, and it links in with Steve's question, the similarity or difference between ourselves and plants. You showed us this beautiful research of these plants of different species sharing resources and so on, but I was thinking about some plants, I think eucalyptus trees, poison the soil around them to stop other plants. So in other words, it would seem that most species are generous and enlightened and sharing, but then there are these minority species that are kind of nasty and selfish. And I'm thinking, well, this is rather like human society where, 90% of people are decent and generous and they'll stop if you have a flat tire, and then, 10% are. So it would seem that, what do you think of that?
There certainly are. That's called allelopathy, which you were just saying. So yeah, there's a whole range of species that do this. Black walnut is another one. Knapweed is another one. There's a whole bunch of them. So that's what we see, right? We go out and we look and say, oh, that's void of an understory, or it doesn't have any neighbors nearby. But chances are that it is linked up to something. It's just not where we're seeing it. It's not right under its understory. Because, like I was saying before, like every tree, every plant lives in a context. It's got its own community. And there's no plant out there that lives by itself. And so just because, it has this interaction where it keeps its neighbors away by chemicals. I don't dispute that, actually. I think that that's true. For whatever reason, it needs to do that. But it's interacting in a whole myriad of other ways with other species, other plants, bacteria, fungi that we can't see, that is creating, or out of it is coming its supportive community. And I'll just mention, we've actually looked at how far apart trees can be when they're linked up. They can be like 50 meters away and be linked up. So, in these trees like black walnut, they're in a forest. They're not that far apart. So, anyway.
Now, one of the through lines that really struck me in all of your talks is, it would seem to me, kind of reviving a spirit of animism. Of the sense that the entire world is alive, and we can perhaps explore whether that includes the inanimate world too. And I'm just, and I think there's been a tendency to think, okay, those people the indigenous people who live in the Amazon, that's kind of cool what they do, but in the modern age, in the scientific age, what we know about the world today. Animism is kind of old-fashioned. And so I guess my question is animism a viable worldview for those of us who live in the modern world?
Animism is coming back after a long vacation. I think that there's no question that there is an aspect that we need to remember, that when we talk about plants or animals, we're talking ordinarily here about non-spiritual aspect. And in indigenous cultures, that's very much alive. And the animism that we describe in shamanism, not a matter of belief, it's a matter of actually talking with the spirits of these things. So animism, you're right, is a belief system, but usually it's a belief system by people who have not had the first-hand experience, because with the first-hand experience, it's not a matter of belief, it's a matter of first-hand knowledge. And I would say it would be very interesting, I've never done it, to journey to a eucalyptus spirit and see what's going on. I doubt very many people have done that, but it's, 15, 20 minutes worth a while.
Wade, do you want to weigh into this? Is animism? What do we who live in, let's say, Madison, Wisconsin, can we incorporate an animist perspective into our daily life?
Just back to what Suzanne and Jeremy were saying. I think there's a tendency to anthropomorphize this whole thing, and the use of the word intelligence I find a little disturbing. I feel that, for example, what Suzanne presented us today was absolutely miraculous and mind-blowing to me. But the weakest point of it for me actually was a correlation with the First Nations on the coast. And I thought that was a nice sort of poetic allusion, but I think almost irrelevant to what you're presenting. And what you're presenting is, in fact, the genius of our ability as scientists to reveal the wonders of the natural world, of which we were blind just weeks before. And I think it was Jeremy mentioned that dreadful book that came out in the 1970s, The Secret Life of Plants. It said that plants like Mozart and they like to be massaged and all that. And Timothy Plowman, who was with me in Columbia when that book came out, was a masseuse, poet, botanist, just about everything wonderful in the world, but he hated that book. And he used to say to me, why would a plant give a shit about Mozart? And even if it did, why should that impress us? They can eat light. Isn't that enough? and the point is that what I really think that Suzanne's research is all about is not trying to find correlations with, of course, human beings use reciprocal engagements. Of course, we share. Of course, there are these superficial similarities, but what you're really revealing is a level of sophistication in terms of biological wonder, which is what we all intuit the Earth is all about. That's what Gaia is. That's what the vision of the Earth from space brought home to us. And so I think I'm a big advocate of elaborating the wonder of what is, as opposed to what we in our desperation may imagine it to be. And one of my biggest concerns is the absolute failure of scientists to communicate the wonders of science to the public at large, and how you can go through a university in this country, and you could never get through any modern university if you couldn't tell poetry from prose or a painting from a photograph, but you can easily graduate from a 4-year college in America without knowing what photosynthesis is. And because of that, we wonder why the public has trouble working its way through the miasma of an issue like climate change. And so I feel there's almost a kind of academic and almost spiritual responsibility to remain utterly grounded on many of these issues, because the science is so revelatory and needs to be highlighted so much. And your work, I think, is just mind-blowing. I don't know if I was scribbling away like mad during her lecture, because I knew all about mycorrhizal relationships, but I had no idea they were sophisticated. What we heard today was simply wondrous. And I'm kind of like Tim. Isn't that enough?
How important is it for science to try to explain the things that we've been talking about today?
Let me just jump in. This is the whole dilemma. Science can only answer the question how. It can never answer the question why. And that's why there's never been any natural divide between science and faith. And so science has to continue to answer the question how and leave the question the why to people like Michael.
So is let's say the ayahuasca experience, is that a how or a why question?
Well, it depends what your line of inquiry is.
Well, the question
is how. Go to Dennis McKenna; he'll tell you how.
Can science explain what's going on in someone's ayahuasca experience?
I would just say it can explain the pharmacology, and it begins to explain the way it works on the brain, but there are all kinds of levels of why that it can't explain, I would think.
Well, Animism, your question, depending on how it's defined, the contemporary definitions in anthropology of animism center on people who recognize kinship with other species and to consider other species as persons. Well, kinship with other species, proposed by Darwin, the idea has been within the scientific worldview, and over the last 150 years has been gradually accepted and then through molecular biology demonstrated. And through the how of, so how is it? So DNA molecules and 3.8 billion years, not just of wisdom, but of transmission of DNA molecules. And so now I think we know that this has occurred and we all have a common bacterial ancestor and so on. So there it is. And we know the mechanics of it, how it happened. What it means, well, there's the question of what drove it. That's another question. It's almost a theological question, so that we're getting immediately outside of science. But even just thinking about how it occurred, what does it mean? What's the meaning of it? I think it's pretty clear that even though it's been within Western culture for 150 years, the actual implications of it, that we are members of the same family as every blade of grass, every bacterium, and so on, and that we're all on the same team, and that we're of the same cloth, as you said this morning, that hasn't been integrated into our culture because we come out of this culture that separates the human, the Judeo-Christian rational culture that has been fixated on, and it's in our vocabulary, so we can't even talk about other species without having to debate every single word. So science, I think, is inviting animism back into the culture. Even animism has been on a vacation, as Michael was saying. But it isn't up to science, as Wade was saying, to bring this meaning. Science has been kind enough to put the mechanics of it or how it happened on the table. So I think it's up to us all to make meaning of it. And yes, drinking ayahuasca or drumming or meditating or just sitting next to a tree or reading books. I mean, there are many ways to get to Rome, but the Rome in question is to understand what it means.
I was just going to say, I think we need a new language. I mean, the word animism is so powerfully evocative of the notion of sort of people communing with stones in the desert or something, and it's not. The new animism is coming out of that vision of the Earth from space. I mean, how can you see that blue planet, so tiny, that tiny little thing, the only animate thing in the universe that we know of, how can it not all come from the same genetic root? It's so obvious that every organism is connected to every other simply because you see it from space. I mean, and similarly, the new revelations of contemporary population genetics haven't even had a generation to percolate into the consciousness. You know, we're always so impatient with the pace of historical transformation, and that's why I always use that reference point about gay people, people of color, and women in a single generation. I mean, that represents a sea change of transformation, and it takes time for those changes to be absorbed in the public consciousness, and I think that's what is really going on, and that's the great hope for the future, is when we really will believe in Gaia and see it as the central metaphor of our lives, you know. And so when people speak of environmentalism as being a new religion, in a sense it is a new religion. It's a whole new point of view.
Yeah. Wade, I'd like to ask you a question. How do you feel about the idea of spirits, of beings, including plants?
You know, Mike, it's a really good question. You know, I'm a little like Schultes. You know, I mean, you know, I always, I really liked what you said today about how you made that transition from being an academic almost to becoming a participant in the shamanic path. I've always been so not hesitant to do that, but so deeply respectful of these different cultures. In fact, everything I say about every culture having a deserved place at the Council of Human Knowledge, every culture having something to teach us, it's that respect that keeps me a little bit back from the culture. Like whenever I was in Haiti, all the Haitians used to always say, qui qualité blanc sayo, and, he's possessed, he's been taken by Dambalawedo. Always were saying I was possessed. And of course I wasn't possessed. And the very idea that I could become possessed would deny, in my point of view, would deny the people the richness of the very religion that I was trying to celebrate.
But how are you so certain you weren't possessed? Is that a matter of faith?
No, I mean, you can't think your way into faith. I mean, it's a very personal thing. I mean, when I was a little boy at the age of, my parents never saw the inside of a church, and for some reason, from the age of 4, I started to go to church every Sunday on my own, and I never missed a Sunday. And I don't know why I did it. My parents never went to church. And then when I kind of came of age and lost that faith for all the same reasons many people lose Christian faith, I think all my life I've been searching to find that again.
But you have faith you were not possessed. That's a faith.
No, I just...
Oh, it's a belief.
I just don't think I was taken by the Spirit.
Yeah, it's an opinion.
Yeah, opinion. Well, yeah.
So I'm just wondering whether an opinion like that vetoes the teachings of indigenous people. We owe so much to indigenous people in terms of the knowledge of plant medicines and so on. My own route in anthropology, in terms of shamanism, has been to take them seriously. And if I can't understand why something works, then I feel it's my problem, not their problem. And every time I've delved most deeply into it, I learned that, in fact, it was my ignorance, not theirs. And for so long, the academic community has viewed them as subjects to really be told in books, not by the people themselves, not to speak to the people themselves directly, but in books after you get out of the field to tell people what really was going on with these people, these ignoramuses, because we have the paradigms. And so my life is, in many respects, is devoted to taking their views seriously. So if they think you're possessed, and if I was in your situation, I would say, wow, why do they think that?
Well, I gave it thought. I mean, I've done exactly the same thing in my career, Michael. Going as a student, giving voice to the people, accepting what they say to be truth.
So let me just follow up on, and this is a question for Michael and for Susan, this question of spirits of plants. Yes, they exist?
Well, the first question is, do spirits exist? The human soul is a kind of spirit. Now, there are people that are killing each other all over the planet over this very question, who has the right entree to spirits, and how is it being done? There's no question that people believe in spirits. There are a lot of people who believe in God. There's a spirit right there. Einstein believed in God. So
there's a big debate about whether Einstein believes in God.
Well, all these things are subject to debate we're talking about. But he used the word God. That's the important thing. Whether he believed what he was saying, that's another thing. Maybe he was a liar. I don't know.
But he was very explicit about not believing in a personal God, at least.
That's separate from saying God does not play dice. Okay? So I feel emotional about this, as obvious is the case, and I want to defer to Susan because this is not a subject that I deal with well, except it's so obvious that the world is being affected by beliefs in souls, which are a kind of spirit. Now, are we going to only have souls for humans and no souls for anybody else? What's going on?
Susan?
Great, Mike. I was thinking, just in listening to all of this, is that I tend to be a very practical person in many ways, and even if I don't like the word necessarily intelligence one way or the other. I think words are a problem, but what I was thinking of in terms of shamanism, my experience with shamanism has always been, I was trained as a lawyer, so I always have an aspect. There's always a part of me that says, all right, this is very interesting what you're doing here, but I've learned to live with that, because that to me is part of the enculturation. That's not going to go away, and I admire very much the scientific approach, etc. But what I see is that we have created a culture where there is such a dichotomy between spirit, and science. And I don't see that they're that different. I don't see they're that different. And so when I work with shamanism, what I see is I ask the question, does it work? Does it make the life bigger? Does it promote harmony and balance? Not am I making this up, which is more of a scientific approach. Am I deluded? Am I this? Am I that? That would be an approach I would have toward nature too. So in my mind, if I look at an ecosystem like you were describing, Suzanne, where you look at that and those connections, and I'm awestruck too. I just think, wow, that is so incredible. But it's incredible because it's a perfect adaptation. It is absolutely beautiful. And it's only humans that at one level right now seem to not have this perfect adaptation to our system. And I think it's partly because of the culture we've got. So what I say is, okay, I'd say, all right, what's happening? How do you restore harmony and balance? Because I think that if we understood our connections with everything that is, if we had the respect for I'll use again a separate term, the natural world that we try to have for each other and for humans, if we treated everything the same, and if we had, I am totally in awe of those trees that support each other when they're under stress. That is absolutely beautiful, So they are, in my mind, if you want to use the word, they are totally intelligent because they work. It works, and it's only when someone else interferes with it, with that cycle, out of arrogance. I think that in some senses, I love science. I've always been a very mental person in that sense. I love science, but in some senses, our arrogance of thinking that this small brain can know everything that is, that can take things apart, can understand all that is, and then can decide what's best for another system, that can look at that world from space and see all of its total elegance and think, well, I'll just seed the clouds over here and make rain, not having a clue as to how to understand how the whole thing fits together. We can't even understand how those rhizomes, or what is it, mycorrhizons fit together, barely. You can just see a small portion of it. So anyway, I think what I see with this is that, to me, shamanism offers an answer, because that's what I've in one sense devoted my life to. But I'm under no illusion that it's the only answer.
Do you consider the experiences that people have in their shamanic journeys as being empirical evidence? I mean, empirical in the sense of the way we use empiricism in science?
If it's first-hand evidence observed with the senses, it's empirical. And it can be observed with all the senses in another reality in shamanism. So yes, it would fit the definition of empiricism, perceiving something with all the senses.
I'd love to hear what all of you, if you have a vision for the kind of science that you'd like to see in the coming decades, 25, 50 years from now, because, there's been a kind of a subtle critique of what we would probably call reductionism in science. Sort of the sense that science is just dealing with this kind of material reality, but maybe we need to broaden our definition of reductionism, or do we need a new vision for what science can tell us, a different kind of science? Your thoughts?
Broader, I think, because you use the word material again. Now, depending on what reality you're in, spirits are, quote, material in a reality. Not in this, perhaps, in the same way, but in that. So, I don't know. That's my contribution.
Yeah, that's why we don't use the dichotomy material, non-material, because it's not material.
Suzanne, do you have a vision for the science of the future?
I think I want to make a comment first, though. Science is done by people, right? It's not like this separate thing. It's part of us. We ask the questions, and it's the visionary that asks the great question. And you can take a scientific pathway that is very, narrow, or you can ask a broader question. And if you're brave, and if you're resilient to the comments, the mud that gets slung your way, you can make great progress. So I think that we need to be creative in our questions, and the tools to answer the questions are there. We've developed tools, and there's whole people that devote their lives to creating tools. But some of us ask that clever question using the tools, and we make great progress. So I think, and this is where the link between the science and the spirit is in how we think as scientists, and we talk to each other. You're informing me as a scientist, if I want to call myself that, and that shapes my worldview, because I'm interacting with you. And so my question next time will be a little different than it was before. So I think this interaction among, if we want to call them disciplines, or different kinds of people with different worldviews, is where we need to go. So if I think of a future scientific world, it's interacting with people that are anthropologists and shamanic people, and I can't remember what you are. Anthropologists. I'm so sorry.
Jerry's in his own.
So sorry. I feel terrible. Your talk was great, by the way.
So, Jeremy, you were making the case that plants, I'm going to use this word intelligence that no one here seems to like, but I don't know the better word to use. So, making the case that plants are a lot more intelligent than we think, and there's the question of, there's an ethical question that comes along with this, and you've suggested that perhaps we need to re-examine our food ethics. Do you eat any differently now based on what you know?
Since when?
Since you've been doing all of this research on how intelligent plants are.
Well, I was hungry at lunchtime and I had food like everybody else. But it's true, when I'm at home, which is most of the time, I try as much as possible to know the food I'm eating, especially if it's of animal origin. But the more you can know your food and where it comes from and what's in it and what's on it, the better. And that just seems obvious, not just in terms of ethics, but also in terms of health. I don't know if that starts to answer your question, but it's true that it's a conundrum. The more you realize that the world around you is alive and related to you and intelligent and just like you face the problem that animists the world over face, which is that you're eating your relatives. And that's not an easy fate necessarily. So then you've got to, instead of, that's one of the advantages of separating humans from all the rest. You can just take that steak and eat it, and that's it. But once you feel connected to the living world, then you have these questions that you have to deal with. Still, one has to eat. That said, I spoke once, and then this person walked up to me, and that person claimed to be a breatharian. And, I was saying we have to eat organisms to live.
Because there are the people that, what do they call them? That they only eat the things that fall to the ground, nuts and things like that. But, it's getting to be a...
Not all nuts fall to the ground easily. I want to deal head on with your question about intelligence. Which is more intelligent, these billions of years of species surviving on this planet, or this species we're in, which is about to destroy all life on the planet? Which is more intelligent?
Yeah. It's true. So,
one of the signs of empires falling is an obsession with sex and food. It's true. And I think I'm very practical on these things, and to me, the curse of humanity has been cultural myopia, the sense that my world is a real world, and you guys are failed attempts at being me. The word barbarian comes from the Greek barbarous, one who babbles. If you didn't speak Greek, you didn't exist. And most of these indigenous groups that we've been speaking about, if you translate their word for themselves, it means the people, the implication being that the other blokes over the hill are savages beyond the pale. And that kind of cultural myopia has been the curse of humanity. I mean, the two greatest ideologies in conflict are the two monotheistic religions that are arguing, given their common roots, as to who's got the monopoly on the route to God. And what I think we have to recognize is that we don't exist outside. This thing we call modernity doesn't exist outside of history and culture. It's a product of both. And it's a set of choices that we made, a set of priorities that we established, which have brought us great achievements, a technological breakthrough. And there's not one of us in this room who, if we ripped an arm off in a car accident, would want to be taken to a shaman. But that world has also such narrowly delimited parameters. And think, for example, something as simple as something we deal with in Canada every single day, what it takes a mining company to get a permit to dig open the ground. Well, you basically cobble together a company with less history than my dog, get online and secure the subsurface rights to a place you've never been, the stories you've never heard, the pain of a long winter you've never experienced, or the promise of bright spring. And as long as you can guarantee the government a flow of revenue, either in the form of taxation or royalties, you secure the right to transform that landscape for all time. Now, the fascinating thing in our worldview is that there's not a single metric in the calculus that rationalizes that industrialization of the wild that places any monetary value whatsoever on the land as it was, or conversely, any cost to the commons implicit in the transformation of that landscape. Now, we in the West take that as a given because it's how we've decided to industrialize the wild, but viewed through the anthropological lens, it's totally mad, anomalous behavior. And that's where the critique of anthropology becomes more forceful, not worrying about the semantics of word intelligence, but paying attention to the fact that this worldview of ours, which has achieved great things, is not the only way of thinking about things. And one of the ways we can become more and more respectful of all of these issues is to crack the monopoly of our way of thinking and recognize that it's just one way of thinking and it's not the only way of thinking. That these other peoples aren't failed attempts at being modern. Each, in fact, is this unique answer to a fundamental question: what does it mean to be human alive? So that kind of pluralism and cultural celebration that's where we'll get out of these endless series of conflicts, and where we'll actually begin to be able to live on this planet in a much more reasonable way.
All of you have been calling for a more holistic, a more ecologically sensitive, a more sustainable, not just way of living, but a mindset. I mean, really a change of the way we see the way we interact. If that were really to take root, is that a new religion?
I can't go back to the arm being torn off. That was addressing shamanism directly. Can that be interrupted?
Absolutely, you
All right,
can.
then.
Yes.
If the arm
that's not to knock shamanism. It's just to say shamanism can do certain things and allopathic medicine can do
I'll
certain
contest that, if I may.
Sure.
If that arm is torn off, yes, you get the ER people working on that. You've heard of such a thing as a phantom limb, of course. This is a spiritual thing, too. And so when a treatment is done in an ER or in a hospital, a complementary approach is to deal with that portion of the person's soul that has been lost in the process, a traumatic event. We have much of this happening in Afghanistan and so on. Mm-hmm. So to just treat the one side without the spiritual side, to me, is inadequate treatment.
Right. Now, I wasn't saying don't use a shamanic follow-up. I meant in the moment of crisis, when the arm is in the street and you're bleeding to death, where would you go, Michael?
I'm glad you clarified that.
Where would you go? You'd go to the hospital.
Yeah, I'm glad you clarified that.
And most people would recognize that part. You know, yeah, of course, I I go to doctors. I love doctors. I think it's great. But I also see that it's incomplete. And many of the medical professionals we have now coming to us see that they're dealing with something very important that's absolutely necessary, but it hasn't filtered down to a lot of people yet that also there are spiritual aspects to these kinds of illnesses that are every bit at some level important for the total healing to happen as the arm. But yeah, if I get my arm torn off, I'm going to stop the bleeding and go.
Another really important point is that 85% of the world's population do not have access to allopathic medicine, and the only source they do have is the therapy and the comfort of traditional medicinal therapies, including shamanism.
I interrupted you.
No, so to come back,
to
come back to the question, if we really do develop this more holistic worldview, is that a new religious sensibility? Should we even use the language of religion here? Is that important?
Well, if religion is a blanket of comfort that gives meaning to life, allows people to make sense out of sensation, find order and meaning in a universe that may have none, to do what Lincoln said, always seek the better angels of our nature, then it is a form of new religion, and a good one.
I was thinking maybe, again, we're in terminology here. This is what's so difficult, because when we hear religion now, typically most of us think of, quote, organized religion, which is in some senses, I've heard it said by Michael, and I agree with this, that it's a mixture of politics and spirituality. So when you get politics involved in anything, things get more complicated. So to me, I think we're talking about something, in my mind, bigger than religion. We're talking about a worldview shift. And again, I don't know if that's the right word either, but it would be an approach where you would approach life, I would see, again, approaching life, and even holistic is not quite the right, we don't have terms for it yet, so it's really hard. But what we're really talking about is seeing what's real, what's true. And the reality is that we are physical beings, we are material beings, we're emotional beings, we have, there is a lot, and I'm talking now humans, but it's actually generally true of life in general. Each, at least from a shamanic viewpoint, each of those things has everything, including rocks, including soil, including earth, including the whole earth itself, has a physical being. It has an ordinary reality aspect, this aspect. It has a spiritual aspect that's in more non-ordinary reality. And so it would be like, right now we are coming from, if you will, an older or a transitioning worldview, and so we have to sort of break it apart, and it's not natural. I think of it like right now, if you want to know how to run an electronic device, if you're an older person, give it to a 12-year-old, suddenly, and all of a sudden they're setting everything, and like that. So to them, they have not known not having that. We are sort of in a transition point. I think it's a very exciting time to be alive, because we are able to be part of this transition in some way, at least like I hope I am. So anyway, I think that at some point it will be as unnatural, I hope, to us to look at other species as just simply objects for our own use, as it is now, as it has been in the past, in the 50s. I did a report in college once. It was actually pretty cool. That we had to look at a year's worth of old magazines, something like Time magazine. So I went to like 1928 or something. Time magazine, had to look at a year's worth and then write what was the worldview of that culture based on what you read in the magazine, including advertisements and stuff. And there were smokestacks and industrialization, and nobody had ever heard of ecology or thought about it. It was totally, how can I use this? And so that was the worldview. You didn't question it. And some of you have talked about that. And now, here we are questioning it, saying, and being appalled and outraged when we clear-cut a forest. If a forest is not desks, then, what good is it, kind of thing. And so I hope my vision is that at some point that we will not we will be so transitioned that these issues won't even be questions we're asking. We'll ask new questions because I think we evolve. Anyway.
I have more questions, but I am guessing that our audience has questions as well. So if you can raise your hands, and I will call on you, but you have to wait for a mic, and there are a couple of mics. So let's go to the gentleman right. Oh, okay, sure.
If you can share as well.
So let's go to the gentleman over there.
Which one?
Right there.
Oh, hello.
Just a thought about the question about food ethics. It seems to me that the issue in some ways is moot. Most organisms of whatever sort are here to, part of their reproductive cycle is being eaten or being consumed in some fashion. So it seems to me that we oughtn't necessarily feel bad about eating a blade of grass or whatever it is. And the question becomes, I think, a little different when you think of the niches in which each organism lives and how it supports the life around it.
Let's another question, comment. Let's go to up here, Dave in the second row. Do we have? Yeah. Okay. Sorry. If you can just be a little patient.
I think all your perspectives are very interesting, but I think there's a fundamental problem in that the power brokers that run things are driven by greed and accumulation of wealth. And we've seen a lot about the inequality of wealth in this country especially, but globally. Until that fundamentally changes, I don't think we're going to be able to see the kind of perspectives that you have, which most everyone in this audience shares, and I think would probably agree, like, how do we change that? And these are all great perspectives, but I think until there's some kind of a social revolution that focuses us back on the common good instead of some group of people making lots and lots of money, we're not going to see these things happen. And I think that's not necessarily related to what you said, but until that happens, I don't think we're going to see real change. Because I think everyone here would agree with many of the things you're saying. Appreciation for Gaia, environmentalism, sustainable resources, and so forth. But these people at the top who are just accumulating more and more money and are driven by greed, until we can find a way to change that, I don't think we can change the culture.
Response?
I agree with the importance of social revolution, but our work is also revolutionary because at the present time there are wars between religions, and one of the things that we attempt to do is to get people rid of the idea that they have to belong to an organized faith and that they can go and see for themselves, what is this thing about heaven? What is this thing about hell? To undermine the autocracy, the theocracy of a few ancestors of religions that are being followed in lockstep. So agreed, you have to have the social revolution, but there's no reason not to try to have a spiritual revolution too, in my opinion. And that's much of what we're doing, trying to do, I mean.
Did anyone else want to follow up on that? Do you want to counter the pessimism voiced here? Sorry.
Just a quick response to that. I've spent most of my life dealing with these kinds of issues. Before shamanism, I worked with a foundation where we were trying to build global community and end wars and do all those kinds of things, materialism, all of those kinds of things. And what I've discovered and what I think many people have discovered is that you don't save the world from the top down, that to the extent each person can have their own independent, somehow either spiritual experience, however they get it, whether it's through something like shamanism or it's something like going through science and seeing the beauty of that, seeing the earth from space. So if people could have the experience of the oneness, the fundamental oneness of all things, and I mean to have the experience, not just say, yes, I've studied it scientifically and I understand it, but really have that experience, it changes you at quite a fundamental level, and you actually then end up making different choices. I don't know how much hope there is for the people at the top until the people everywhere at some level take charge and at some level make changes right now, right where we are, as quickly as possible, and tell their friends.
Are you suggesting that for this mind shift to change, as most of the people here would like, that basically everyone needs an experience of non-ordinary reality?
I would say that could do it. I really do. I believe it.
It's as opposed to taking a second-hand account from somebody who's experienced 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago of such an experience. Which would you rely on more, your own first-hand empirical experience or something that's been passed on for thousands of years?
Jeremy?
Excuse
No,
me.
sorry, I think Jeremy was going
go
to
ahead.
Sorry.
add something.
So many people who want to.
No, go ahead.
Okay.
I have no vested interest in these positions.
Well, I've been busy remaining silent on the question of religion here, quite deliberately, because it's not my thing that much. My mother always told me not to talk about religion and money and so on. Anyway, but no, I'm an agnostic, and because I think the world is mysterious and it's difficult to know. I think, I can't remember who was saying that today, but we have these small heads, and so there it is. And I think it's okay to sit with the fact that many things are hard to know. And I'm not that interested in believing, but I know that this is a religious country, and I respect everybody's worldview. I'm talking for myself. I'm interested in knowing, not believing. Because one can believe anything, but what's really interesting, in my view, is trying to know things. But then, as Dave was speaking, I was thinking, yeah, he's right. Maybe it's true to change this greed thing that is there and that exists. Maybe what's needed is a more religion or new religion or something like that. And religion actually has its purpose. Like people who are religious, it seems, are much less prone to drug addiction than those who are not, for example. So it does have its good sides. But then I was thinking, well, if we make this difference between belief and knowledge, that one simple idea, I think the thing about greed and accumulating wealth is people want to accumulate objects. Well, instead of accumulating objects, one could encourage them to accumulate knowledge. And that's what I try to simply embody. Look at me for how much I know. Don't look at me for all the jewelry I'm wearing or my big car. And just to encourage that idea that having things is not cool, but knowing things is cool.
Let's go to the back there.
It's just an idea.
So, Susan and Michael, I just want to thank you for a great introduction to shamanism. So I guess you've mentioned a couple times about this human seeking this unity with these alternate or different realities, these other worlds. And, I sort of wonder, why would these realities and these spirits want to encounter humans when we seem to be the source of all this discord in the world? So, and when you're interacting with these spirits, how does that, affect? Are you getting negative encounters when you're seeing them? So
these beings are very these compassionate spirits that we find in the upper and lower worlds, at least again from the shamanic perspective. There are a couple of thoughts. One would be to, when you know how to do this, you journey on this and you ask them why they're interested in helping. And so that's always a wonderful thing to do. It just in general, the simplicity of it, at least for me, is that some of them may at one point have existed in this reality and they know about pain and suffering. So they're extremely compassionate. So they don't operate under the same kinds of dichotomies that we do. So they're interested purely in helping to ease pain and suffering in this dimension. This is the pain and suffering realm, and they want to help. So generally.
Can a human leave this dimension and exist only in this spiritual dimension?
When you're dead. Yeah. Yeah, when you leave your body, you can. Mostly you don't want to do that. You don't want to leave it for too long.
Let's go in the back there.
Well, that relates to my question, which is in my relations with indigenous peoples, I see other related concepts, and again, we're stuck with words, but of related to animism, stewardship of their environment, stewardship of the planet, and counseling from ancestors. And ancestors are really a big part of our source, a collective human source for answering questions about conflict, about responsibilities, about what to do in any situation. And when, with my students and colleagues who, and most of us, it looks like in this room, are descended from Western European ancestors, and we're dislocated, translocated to another region, and we're all mixed up together, and we don't really think about our ancestors as our guides and counselors. So I just wonder how you see that with this revitalization of animism, how you see that, the ancestor question.
Who would like to take that?
I talked enough.
Anybody else?
I guess
Sure. Yeah. Go ahead.
I think it's completely fluid and self-evident that the ancestors in the plant and animal world is hugely important. In forests, we call these things legacies, or the gene pool, or the species load, or carbon that's stabilized for long periods of time. And those legacies are what generates wisdom in the next generation, and actually engenders life to keep going. So, and I think that, in the tree world, one of the things that we're doing in science right now is trying to identify who those wise souls, if we can call them that, in trees, are the ones that we need to focus on so that we can make great progress with them. So in other words, why would we say some are more important than others? Well, think of trees, they're long-lived organisms. Some of them are 5,000 years old, bristlecone pine. Kauri trees can be a couple thousand years old. That's a long time. And from previous climates, and they've lived through a lot. And they have genetic material that reflects that, that's mutated and adapted to different climates. They produce new leaves, new mycorrhizal associates every year. And so they carry with them this incredible genetic wisdom. And so to me, it's like there's no problem. Maybe I missed the point of your question, but to me, it doesn't take a great leap of faith to say that, yes, that these ancient wise ones are hugely important in the plant and animal world.
We have time for one last question. Let's go over there.
Thank you all for your time and being here. I guess this question is primarily for Jeremy, but I'm certainly interested in what other folks might have to say. In your talk, you wrestled quite a bit with these issues of language, and you swept across a number of thinkers that use allied yet very different language. So, for instance, you talked about, I think in a single paragraph, Latour, who sort of uses actants, and you swept across Derrida's deconstruction, and then Haraway, who's moved from cyborgs to material semiotic actors. And as you were talking, I thought about, there's sort of this well-known comment by Nietzsche, right, to not worry too much about the distinctions of grammar, that subject and object divides does not imply ontological reality. And yet at the same time, these debates about grammar and word choice have been very present in the conversation this afternoon. And I'm wondering if you can just sort of elaborate a little bit more on your journeys through these politics of language, some of the resistance maybe that you've come up against in using that word intelligence, and if you have a sense about the significance or the importance of engaging some of those debates around language, how we use intelligence, how we use nature, how that might be fruitful or not.
Well, I tried to talk about that in my talk today, but still I'll just give an example on the basis of one of the things that we were talking about here, and it's a thing that I was going to say but didn't, so now I'll say it. Talking about the word spirit. Essentially, my point of view, and it's not taken from anybody else, but simply let's do one word at a time and look at each word, look at its etymology, unpack it. In other words, it's kind of a slow process. That's why writing books is a slow process. You have to choose one word after another. So, like the word spirit. We were talking about, do you believe in spirits? Do you not believe in spirits? So what is spirit? Well, it's a Latin word, spiritus. It means breath, comes from breath of God. So here we are. We're in a monotheistic word, and it was essentially, in its original meaning, it's what God insufflated into human beings and not into the others. That's where it came from. And if you look in the dictionary, so then this is a pretty basic approach. It's not anything fancy. I'm not calling this deconstructionalism a la Lacan or whatever. It's just, what does the word mean? What's its etymology? What's the first meaning in the Oxford English Dictionary? Well, or in a French dictionary, it doesn't really change. What you find in the word spirit, and this is why I think it's interesting to unpack these words. So they're like suitcases, and you go through customs, you say, stop, what's in this suitcase? A whole bunch of dirty laundry, in fact. And so what we have with spirit is that the what is implied in the meaning of the word is that it is essentially immaterial. Spirit as opposed to material. We've got another dichotomous word on our hands. Now, I like to think with indigenous people. So my Ashaninka friends, how do they? So when anthropologists go and they're in the Amazon and the natives are communicating with spirits, say the anthropologists, what do the Ashaninka say? They say, no, Maninkari is those who are hidden. It's not, and so these Maninkari, so they're beings, they're hidden. So in other words, the dichotomy is more between visible and invisible than between material and non-material. When we translate Maninkari by spirit, we're putting a Western dichotomy on their concept. Meanwhile, when they're in their trances and they call the spirit of tobacco, actually, the word they use is the word for tobacco. They're not calling a spirit or a non-material principle associated with tobacco. They're actually calling tobacco, and what they mean is the essence of tobacco. They're calling tobacco-ness. So, me translating their culture, they're saying that tobacco has an essence or a tobacco-ness or like a personality to it, and it's associated with a melody. None of this is strictly non-material. In fact, it's quite material. This tobacco essence is part and parcel of the tobacco plant, and once that essence leaves the plant, you have a cadaver. That's the difference between life and death. So actually, these essences are not that non-material. So so that's unpacking one word, not in any fancy-pantsy way, just saying, stop, what's the etymology, what does it mean, does this actually correspond to what people are saying? And so this is, I don't know, too long into the microphone, but that's the work. If we're going to be Westerners making sense of non-Western cultures and traditions, that's the work that one has to do.
Thank you for being a wonderful audience, and thank you to our terrific speakers.
Okay.